is my real pleasure to announce our speaker for today's event. We are very excited to have it. Before we get into it, I want to say a huge thank you to our mutual friend, Jill Hall, from Von Briesen, who connected the two of us. Jill is a stalwart member of the DMI Inclusiveness Committee and a great friend of DMI and is joining us here today. So I want to give a shout out to Jill before we introduce Jesus. But Jesus Villa serves as the administrator for the Equal Rights Division of the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development. The Equal Rights Division enforces over 40 different laws, including workplace, civil rights law, employee leave laws, and minimum wage and hour laws. Prior to his appointment, Jesus was the lead employee relations consultant at the Equal Opportunities Officer for Northwestern Mutual. He holds a JD and an MA in public policy from Duke University and a BA in sociology from Princeton University, where he graduated magna cum laude. Jesus lives in Wauwatosa with his wife and children. He is active in various community organizations, including his church, and, as we already mentioned, is a part-time singer-songwriter. And he said earlier that he turned his studio into his office. So I think that's where we are these days in COVID. So he's really doing multiple things at once. But I think you did say, Jesus, you still are writing songs from your office, and you did play your banjo for the secretary at one point. Is that true?
One time. It was a particularly low point of the quarantine period where everyone needed a little cheering up that only a banjo could bring.
Awesome.
But thank you.
The floor is yours. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, we were talking about, I'm going to share this with the group just because it really ties into what I wanted to discuss today. But as Jason mentioned, I had to convert my meager home studio into my workstation. And now I'm speaking to you on my personal computer. Over to my right is my work computer. I've got way more things on my desk than I've ever had before, and had to move some things out of the way and learn how to use technology that I really haven't had to learn to use before. Learn new vocabulary like virtual happy hours and Zoom and WebEx and Google Meets and all sorts of things I've never had to do before, and yet managed to find ways to kind of make things work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience we've had with all of that in the Equal Rights Division, insofar as it, I think, connects to what most of you have experienced, and share a little bit of that and talk to you about how we pivoted with our services. It's been an interesting time, but the topic that I wanted to talk about was that everything and nothing has changed, which over and over in the last several months, I found reminders of where that tends to be true. It's hard not to wake up on a daily basis and listen to the news on the radio, look around and look at your routine, and not focus on how much in our daily lives has in fact changed, and how much is different, and what things we can't do, and what has evolved. And yet, there is this normalcy that is preserved throughout all of it. And especially in the work that we're doing in the Equal Rights Division and in workforce development, the context has changed, but the core laws, the core rules, and the core operations to a large extent haven't. We've just had to sort of adjust it and in many cases reframe it. Many times we learn from that and we get positive experiences. So I want to share those stories because I do think that they're relevant. I think by sharing the stories too, I'm going to give you a little more insight into what we actually do, if you're not familiar with what we're doing at the Equal Rights Division. And I will give you an overview. And then I'm going to go into some of the current initiatives that we're working on that will help sort of tie all of that together. I am going to share my screen. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that helps me kind of stay on task. As I was joking with Jason as we were preparing for this, I sometimes need to be told when to shut up, when to stop talking. The PowerPoint will help me kind of stay on task. So for those of you who aren't big fans of PowerPoint, I apologize, but trust me, it's in all our interests to be able to do this. So Everything and nothing has changed. Workplace rights in 2020, and uh, and what does that really mean for all of us as community members, as employers, and as those supporting different employers? Um, First, let me tell you a little bit about the ERD itself, the Equal Rights Division. Um, this value statement is really the quickest summary that I can give you as to what we actually do and what we're about. And then it was one of the first things that I asked my team to kind of work on and take a look at last year when I joined the ERD. But what the ERD is about is we help make Wisconsin a fair and just place for all people to work. So we focus on all people, and the question of inclusion is central to that. And my team will tell you that every time we're looking at our work, at our numbers, at our data, and at new initiatives, the question is, who aren't we serving? Not just who are we serving, but who aren't we serving, and how do we deal with that? I'm emphasizing that because I think that has a lot of relevance to the way we've had to shift our operations. So I wanted to make sure and point that out. But other than that, this is really the core of what we do on a daily basis and what we're about and what we offer that we think no one else can offer quite as well as we do. Jill, thank you for bringing me in and connecting me with this group. Jill and I know each other because we used to practice law together. I was an employer-side employment lawyer for 10 years before going into Northwestern Mutual. And in the course of that time, as well as in my role at Northwestern Mutual, I got to know the Equal Rights Division and their work very well. And although they were the ones involved in handling complaints usually brought against my clients, I got to have a lot of respect for not just the work that ERD does, but the way they do the work. And honestly, when I got the call early last year from the governor's office asking if I had an interest in taking this on, I was very eager and excited. I have a lot of respect for the work that this division has traditionally done, and gratefully accepted the challenge to kind of take it to the next level. But that's our value statement. Our mission statement is, of course, a little more involved, but it really comes down to three principles. This mission statement predates me, and although we examined it closely, my leadership team and I think we first of all, we decided to keep it because it's still a very good summary of what we do. And I'm just going to walk through it because I really want to emphasize how this ties into the work that we do. Number one, we exist to protect the rights of all people in Wisconsin under the civil rights laws and labor standards laws that we administer. So we are first and foremost about protecting those rights, and whatever that may entail. Yes, there are particular processes, and a lot of what we do boils down to receiving, investigating, and hopefully in most cases resolving complaints that are brought up under these laws. And as you heard in the intro, we enforce over 40 different laws. It's quite a myriad of laws. Our investigators are extensively cross-trained so that they've got expertise across the board, and in many situations, some very, very deep expertise. We have a lot of our staff that has been with the ERD for a long time and quite literally has written the book on what those laws are in Wisconsin when it comes to employment discrimination laws, when it comes to wage and hour laws pertinent to Wisconsin. But number two is actually what I've challenged my team in many ways to really look at, and that's to achieve compliance through education, outreach, and enforcement by empowered and committed employees. And I would say in the bulk of my time with the division, it's around this second bullet point that we've had the most activity. And I'm going to kind of work my way backwards through that bullet point a little bit. First, the empowered and committed employees. When you have leadership changes every 4 years or so, or in some cases more frequently when you're looking at the division level, figuring out what the staff looks like, how they feel, how they engage becomes all the more critical. And when I came on board, we were facing a lot of challenges in terms of staff turnover. We were facing some budget challenges that we were trying to deal with, and that was impacting the turnover as well as other things. And with my background in human resources and employment, I realized that if we wanted to do anything, if we wanted to get anything done, we were going to need a staff that was going to step up and do that. So dealing with engagement, dealing with turnover, dealing with hiring and staffing levels has been the bulk of what I've been doing as an administrator over the last year. So to a certain extent, we have to think of things as pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, I guess, or pandemic. So pre-pandemic, we saw that we increased our staffing levels to a point that they hadn't been at in well over 10 years at least. We hired more investigators. We brought on newer investigators so that we could make sure that we were handling the bulk of the complaints that were coming in and reducing the processing time. We also brought in, we did some minor restructuring to strengthen our training and mentoring of that staff so that those staff could get up to speed faster, but also have a support network that could make sure that as questions came up because of all the laws, that everyone was getting supported. And from the customer experience, y'all were getting the best service and the best answers that you could get. And we also brought in someone to really help and own outreach and communications and shape some other things around that space. As far as achieving compliance, the first part of that sentence, this is where I've challenged our staff to kind of shift thinking a little bit. We are very good, I'm going to say, I think we're very good at enforcing the laws through a traditional complaint process. People file a complaint, we investigate it. There's an established process where you can get an administrative hearing, get a review of the facts, and we do our own mediation, and there are a variety of ways where people can resolve their issues, and that's great. But almost all the time, that's one complainant bringing one complaint against one particular employer. And usually by the time that complaint comes around, the mess has already been made. If there's an issue of some sort. Whether or not it's a legal violation, well, that's what we sort through. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that by the time a complaint's gotten filed, there have been a number of opportunities along the way that might have prevented that from happening. And our mission is to achieve compliance, not to process complaints, not to resolve complaints, but to achieve compliance. And so the challenge I brought to the team, and part of the reason that I brought on someone to lead the outreach efforts, is because we wanted to shift more attention to that part of our mission. How can we use education, outreach, resources to not just serve people who are filing complaints, but to really engage and collaborate with employers, with entrepreneurs, and with other stakeholders in figuring out what do we want for the state of Wisconsin, and what do we want to make sure that that is in place to protect all our workers and to advance the economy in different ways. And what can we do so that in the long term, ideally, we're not just counting the number of complaints that get filed to tell us whether or not we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, but we're instead really looking at, are we improving workplaces in the state of Wisconsin? Are we meeting the needs that our workers and their families have? Are we meeting the needs that businesses have? And to do that in a collaborative way. One of the reasons that I took the job is because the governor was saying the same things and the secretary was saying the same things. The idea is, how do we collaborate with everyone and make sure that we're bringing folks to the table? So that's been the mindset that I've had. That's why I think I was asked to step into this role with my particular background of really working within the employer space within the employer community, and bring those things together. And then finally, of course, to perform our responsibilities with reasonableness, efficiency, and fairness. We're always going to be focused on making sure that we are good stewards of taxpayer dollars, but also that we are we're making sure that we're leveraging things like new technology. We're meeting folks where they are and bringing us as an agency into the 21st century, occasionally kicking and screaming, but at least moving in that direction to figure out how can we do this better at all times. So all of that, of course, had to shift a little bit back in, I guess, as early as February, but certainly in March, when all of a sudden we're dealing with the realities of a global pandemic, and we're dealing with the economic impact of that pandemic. It's affected our agency in many ways. I think DWD, so Equal Rights Division, is part of the Workforce Development Department. And a lot of the focus, understandably, has been on the large number of people that are suddenly unemployed or underemployed, and making sure that they are getting the protection and the benefits to which they're entitled. And then on top of that, of course, the new benefits that the federal government put out there and we're administering. There's enough that has been in the news and in conversation about how overwhelming that task has been and how much scrambling it has required us to really deal with this very suddenly rising and dramatic situation. For us in Equal Rights Division, a lot of what we do has been to help support the unemployment division in the work that they are doing, but also making sure that we are still keeping an eye on our mission and doing our job and making sure that we've got the resources and we've got the focus on doing all of that. So there has been a lot that has changed with regard to our work, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the worker rights and the need for the services that we provide really has fundamentally not changed. For many, it's changed only in its urgency or in the type of issues that we find ourselves dealing with. But the fundamental protections that are in place have not changed for the most part. And employees' needs, employers' needs, those things have not changed. For example, of course, workers still have to be paid in accordance with the law. That hasn't changed. But in the pandemic situation, we've had a number of different issues come up more frequently with regard to what that means. Certainly some of it has to do with businesses that suddenly have had to shut down or lay off workers, and because of the economic pressures that they've been under. And so we deal with those. We deal with wage recovery in situations where workers may not have been paid the wages they are owed when that happens. But we've also had a number of interesting questions come up, for instance, with regard to work time and what is considered work time. All of us are participating on this call right now, and I think most, if not all of us, are probably working remotely. The challenges of tracking when are people working, when, I don't know about all of you, but my sense of time, dates, calendars, clocks, has gotten pretty messed up with regard to these new work arrangements. And I happen to be an exempt employee, but for many workers, questions about, well, when am I actually starting work? When am I on the clock, off the clock, have gotten a little more complex. And so we've had a number of questions come up sorting that out. Similarly, with the question of overtime, that really just ties in. And the law has not really changed in terms of when is someone working, when is someone owed overtime. The exemptions are still in place that were in place before, and the requirements are still in place. It's just that they have to be applied in sort of a different context than many people are used to. And that's required a little bit of scrambling from the businesses that we work with, And we've gotten a number of calls where we've been advising employers as well as workers on how to sort through that. I think many have found that the more complex issue, when you've got a large chunk of your workforce either switching to remote work or in some cases just changing work shifts and whatnot, is the question of record keeping. And I've talked to some small employers who their systems simply were set up for working a particular way that now their workforce is not, they're not working that way. How do you keep track of time worked? How do you keep track of time off when people aren't in an office and things like that? All of a sudden, as businesses have had to shift and change all of that, the record keeping hasn't always kept up with it. And there have been some cases where suddenly, maybe a couple months into the remote work, businesses are suddenly realizing, oh, wait, we're not using our timesheets or our time process in the way that we used to, and things like that. And so that's required some pivoting. And again, the laws, the rules haven't changed, but suddenly they have to be applied in a different context that challenges many to figure out, well, how do I do this in this space? Another thing that we're dealing with is workers still have to be appropriately classified. And I served on the governor's task force with regard to employee misclassification. And I know, and I think many people, if not most people, recognize that it is a challenge, that the way we think of the workforce nowadays is not limited to employee and employer, and that's the entire dynamic. But we have a situation where we have independent contractors, we have gig workers, and we have employees, and we have a lot of misunderstanding about where those boundaries are. And I've spoken with, over the course of years, I've spoken to a number of small business owners or entrepreneurs who simply believe, well, if I decide to pay someone as an independent contractor, then they must be an independent contractor. And that's all it really takes, and that it's sort of a one-sided decision. That's, of course, not the case. It's unfortunately much more complicated, and much more complicated with different state laws as well as with different federal laws. The reason that I think it's important to keep focusing on this question of who is an employee, who's not an employee, and how are we sorting that out, is because we've seen in the current situation more than ever before why that really matters. If you are not an employee, you have questions and challenges you're facing in terms of protections, like, do I get unemployment benefits if the company to which I've been providing services has shut down? The federal government, addressed that through new legislation that sort of just broadened the definition so that there was an opportunity to get benefits when you weren't clearly an employee. And they had to, because without that protection, you have a whole lot of people who don't have any kind of safety net when it comes to income continuation. And similarly with workers' compensation. Workers' compensation across the country right now is kind of struggling with this question of what happens when people get sick and injured because of their work and issues like that. And I'm not going to get into that topic because I have the luxury of not having to get into that topic, not dealing directly with workers' compensation. But I want to share it with you to understand why this question of whether you are an employee or not matters now more than ever when we're in a pandemic, when there are some real questions about worker safety if you're working in a particular place. And so I think that the need for making sure we have clarity around this issue has only been heightened. It's really been spotlit because all the protections that for decades, for over a century, Wisconsin has worked to get in place to make sure we're protecting individual workers and their families, they're challenged by the new work environment we have, and it's getting tested right now. So So that remains a big issue. Restrictions on child labor are unchanged. And let me talk about that a little bit, because I think many or most of you are probably aware that we had to put in place an enforcement holiday around work permits for the 14 and 15-year-olds that have to work. We had to put that enforcement holiday in place because one of the effects of the pandemic is that the work permit offices, schools, county buildings, and even our offices at the state were suddenly closed. There was no public access to them. And if you needed a work permit in order to be able to work, you couldn't get one, at least for some stretch of time. The process of trying to figure out an alternative, an online alternative for processing those work permits was simply unworkable. And we looked at it. And so we made the difficult decision and consulted with the governor's office as well, made the decision that right now we were going to put an enforcement holiday when it comes to child work permits. And in a couple months, that holiday expires, and we put it on employers to make sure that we were, that they were tracking who was coming in and getting proof of age, getting the consent of parents, etc. But here's the thing, is that the enforcement of the permit requirement was suspended, but not the restrictions on what children can't do when it comes to work. And in terms of work hour restrictions, in terms of the type of work, working with dangerous equipment, et cetera, those things are very much still in place. And we're trying to make sure that employers understand that that part of the law has not changed, and there are still obligations that all of us have to make sure that our children are safe as they are getting work experience and entering into the workforce. So I'm making sure that I'm emphasizing that so that everyone understands that. And then finally, employers must still notify of plant closings and mass layoffs. Obviously, we've received quite a few notices in DWD as businesses have had to make some difficult decisions about their workforce or about their operations. I get the question a lot. There are exceptions to the notification requirements that come up, act of God type situations and things like that. And the question usually comes in some variation of, surely under these circumstances, there's no notice requirement. Surely businesses could not have predicted this, and those obligations are not there. In fact, the obligations are there, but so are the exceptions. And what I tell people is that it is likely in most cases that a plant closing that normally would require notice is going to fall in one of those exceptions when that closing or when that layoff is tied to the pandemic or the economic impact of that. But that's a determination that has to be made on a case-by-case basis based on individual facts. Because again, this is to protect the workforce and make sure that that they have an opportunity to be spared some of the greater burdens of that impact. So there's no blanket rule that says any plant closing or any layoff that's happening during this period of time will not require notice. It has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. And the advice that I give most people when they've asked me this question is, number one, talk to your own legal counsel. I'm not their attorney, and figure out what you need to do. But that it's, in almost every case, it makes the most sense to give notice as soon as you can, as soon as you know. At least you're mitigating some possible liability, but in most cases, you're at least demonstrating that you are attempting to comply best you can and things like that. So the notice requirement in cases of layoffs or closings is not suspended. It's still there. But there's a lot of situations where you're going to fall under an exception. So, and with regard to civil rights, again, not a lot of changes. you still can't discriminate against workers on their protected classes. And harassment still is not allowed, and employers have an obligation to protect their employees from harassment based on protected classes. And then finally, employers still have to reasonably accommodate disabilities. So the fundamental pieces of the law have not changed, and the enforcement of those laws has not changed. The only thing that's changed is the context in which we're addressing these issues. So it's one thing to say employers must not discriminate based on workers' protected classes, such as age. But when you're in a pandemic and we're in a situation where most indications are that folks who are older are at greater risk of injury or even death should they contract a virus, then how does an employer navigate these waters in terms of enforcing, who gets to come into the workplace and work, and how do you deal with folks who may have a greater risk of infection in a potentially hazardous environment? That's a complicated question. Still turns on the fundamental issues in the law, but that gives you an example of some of the questions that we've been sorting out. And if any of you are really looking for a deep dive or primer into the particular issues that come up, I don't intend to do that in this call, only because there's so much that is specific to a particular work type, particular environment, or in these type of cases, particular individuals and individual circumstances. But I do want to share that so that two things. One, you understand the complexities that can get involved when you're sorting out who gets to work at home, who doesn't get to work at home, what happens in terms of return to work situations and things like that, and how you make those decisions. To understand that if you are making those decisions based on factors such as age, such as disability, such as marital status, right? Their family status, you're in riskier waters, and you need to be talking to your legal counsel, you need to be talking to HR, or the other point I wanted to make on this, you need to call us. And to realize that you can ask to speak to one of our staff members and say, I need help sorting this out, and how should this work? And we can help give you some guidance in terms of sorting that out. But to understand that as you're sorting those things out, if you're focusing on protected classes like age, like disability, like marital status or others, you are in a riskier situation, and it's much better, much preferred, like it always has been. Make those type of decisions based on work factors, based on what is the work, what are the skills that are needed, and focus in on that. With regard to harassment, I'd say the biggest spin that we've seen, or the twist we've seen on those issues, has to do with this new world, like we're all sharing right now, of what does harassment look and feel like online. And to recognize that online harassment is still illegal, it's still problematic, and it's still something that employers have an obligation to prevent and correct. But when it happens online, it is much harder to find and notice and be aware of. And the process also for bringing forward issues can get much trickier when you're not in a central office, right? So what I would encourage you to do on these, especially if you've got a large number of your workers that are connecting online primarily, is to remind them that, you don't, just because you're online, that doesn't mean that harassment can't happen. It might look different than it did before, but it's still a problem. And you still have rights as an employee that begins with making sure that the supervisor or the HR resources or whoever in your organization is responsible for, make sure that they know how to access those resources even while they're not in the office. Look at your policies, make sure that that's mapped out there and make sure that people understand how that sorts out. Because again, harassment is still a problem. It just kind of looks and feels a little different as we're working a little differently. And then finally, we do get quite a few questions around reasonably accommodating disabilities. The reminder, this is one of those things that hasn't changed. You still have an obligation to reasonably accommodate disabilities. And if someone has a medical need that's impacting their ability to work and they come to you with it, you still need to address it and address it interactively and figure out what you can do to help the individual get their work done. That's, again, one of those things that right now looks and feels a whole lot different. And then the other point that I wanted to make on this, and frankly, it's something that we're dealing with ourselves, like many organizations, is that as we're making changes to people's work arrangements, right? Like let's start with just the whole idea of remote work. There are workers who are working remotely who previously hadn't, right? And their job was modified somewhat so that job tasks that they had to do in an office or in a work setting, they're not doing while they're at home, right? These are pretty common changes right now that we're seeing with a lot of workplaces. Understand that there's some risk into doing these things, in that come 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, when you have an individual worker who is asking to be able to work remotely or not do particular tasks because of a medical condition, because of a disability, and you want to be able to say, no, this is really a central part of your job, I need you to do this, or we don't have work at home available. Understand that the experience we're going through right now is providing evidence of really what modifications you can and can't make, what's reasonable, what's not reasonable, and even information such as, well, what's the cost of doing that? What's the impact of doing that, and things like that. So I'm not telling you not to make those changes. I think the changes are appropriate and behoove us. But it's important to recognize that when these questions come up of how do we accommodate disabilities, as all of us have had to be flexible, agile, and change and make different arrangements, we're already making decisions about what we can and can't do with particular jobs that are going to continue to play out in different ways. And I've seen this play out with regard to, again, who can work at home, who can't, like what work is available to do at home and what can't be done at home. What kind of investments do we make in things like remote technology that maybe we weren't making before, and how can we change particular jobs and things like that. All of those accommodations, even if we're not making it because of an individual disability, they do answer some of those questions. And hopefully, as you're going through this, you're thinking about what that may mean in terms of flexibility for your workers and whatnot going forward. So, so it's interesting times. Fundamentally, the rules, the rights, the protections, the obligations haven't changed, but they're all in a different context now. And especially as we're all scrambling and trying to deal with what that means in our workforces, we're answering those questions in different ways. For ERD specifically, I thought it might be interesting to share what we've experienced. And it's, and overall, I'm really impressed with how we've been able to adapt. 90% of our staff is working remotely now. That was not something, if you had asked me a year ago if we'd be able to do that, I wouldn't have been optimistic about it. But we were able to get 90% of our ERD staff working remotely and do it very quickly, do it in less than a week. And remarkably, doing that with no slowdown in terms of processing complaints. Our numbers on a monthly basis in terms of the complaints that are coming in and how long it's taking us to get through this, really we are on track with where we've been in the last couple of years. It has impacted some of the services we offer. We're not doing any in-person intake because our buildings, frankly, are closed, and we have to protect our staff as well as the public. That's more significant. Now we do case intake, in a variety of ways, including phone and online and email. But it's not insignificant, the in-person intake question, because we typically were getting, between Milwaukee and Madison, 30 to 40 people a week that were coming in physically to bring a complaint or raise questions. So we've had to redirect those to phone and to email, and it's challenging because it's hard to know who we're not seeing that we might otherwise have seen. More on that in a second. We've also not been doing any in-person mediations, and maybe most significantly for some of you, not doing any in-person hearings. The hearing process, we have a traditional administrative hearing process similar to courtroom type proceedings, not something that we were set up to do when the buildings are closed, when we have the pandemic going on. We have seen an increase in the number of mediations that we're doing, and we're doing them by phone. So we're still offering those services, and many of our complainants and respondents are realizing that to move forward, this is the best alternative right now, and we have been seeing that. I talked about the work permit enforcement holiday already. One thing that's critical to me is that we are facing in the state a hiring freeze for non-critical positions. That has not been a big challenge yet, although I grumble about it because we were on a nice growth track in terms of services offered. But it is something that I'm very aware of going into the next fiscal year, and we'll see where that plays out. But also thought it'd be interesting for you to know that nationally, and in Wisconsin especially, or particularly, there's a 10% reduction in the complaints that are getting filed. That's a year-to-year comparison, but we have seen a drop, again, around the country and in Wisconsin. It's hard to say what that means, whether that means people are simply being nicer and more polite to each other, or whether that means that people who are still employed are more worried about holding on to their employment and unlikely to make waves, or if it means that people aren't sure how to access our services if they're not in the workplace. So I'm sharing that data because it's one that I'm looking closely at in terms of figuring out where are we and what we're looking at. But I am proud of the fact that we've got 90% of our staff working remotely. We've been able to support unemployment by supplementing their staff, by answering some questions that do come into us. We've been able to do that without the slowdown in processing the complaints, and that we've seen that increase in mediation. So we're still getting the core of our work done. Our staff engagement levels have been high as we've been testing the waters, and I'm really, really proud of the folks that I work with in terms of stepping up to make sure that we're providing those services. We've also been engaged in our own strategic planning as a division for the next year, and I will admit that it's largely because I'm really kind of geeky about strategic planning. I get weirdly excited about it. I know that puts me in a minority, but I'm sharing this with you because it gives you an idea of how we're looking at the next year with a lot of uncertainty and recognizing that there are changes in how we're working. So focusing in on protecting the health and safety of our staff and the folks we're serving, but doing that while increasing access to our services. So not just preserving some access, but actually looking at how do we leverage distance technology, how do we leverage what we have to actually make it easier for people to come to us when they have questions, when they have concerns. And doing that, I think, has been a really rewarding challenge. I'm going to share some examples with you in a few minutes. Doing this while maintaining a positive employee experience. It is very much a challenge when people aren't coming in to work every day and sharing lunch and sharing conversations. How do you make sure, and where you have, you know, the hiring freeze and things like that, and just the general stress that comes with the current situation. Still focused on increasing outreach and engagement with our partners and external stakeholders, that's you, and looking for ways that we can continue down that path and make sure that we're doing more collaboration and more connection. And then finally, continuous improvement and documentation of our work processes. This is something that, you know, we need to do. It's not as sexy as some of the other work we're doing, but definitely opportunities right now to make sure that we're handling that. So what have we been doing?
One quick question actually on that. There was a question from our audience on that exact
please.
Topic. Yeah, if you don't mind. Do you think the virtual component of your work and service will continue post-pandemic? Sort of part of those goals and to reach out. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. So, so the idea of reaching out was something that we were already embarking on last year. So pre-pandemic, recognizing that this was a need, and that we weren't doing as well as we could. So like everything else, it's still a priority. It's still something that we want to do more of and really make it part of our identity. So that when people say, well, what does the Equal Rights do? It's not just, well, they're the ones who notify me when someone sues me or brings a complaint against me. Suddenly I say, well, what's Equal Rights? Well, we're the experts and a valuable resource when it comes to helping out entrepreneurs and employers around issues here, and to do that through outreach and engagement and collaboration. So yeah, very much so.
Well, I think that as a follow-up from that, from the same person, how do employers collaborate and get involved with that achieving compliance through education? How do we get involved as employers?
Sure, and I'll actually address that in part with some of the next slides, but start with sort of the general comment that I'm available and my staff is always available for those conversations. I really think it's important, and again, having come from working for one of the larger employers in the state of Wisconsin, and prior to that working in a role where I was working with employers of all sizes, and all of the time doing it with a real commitment to worker rights and civil rights. It's central to my personal identity and who I am. But I absolutely know and believe that we don't advance those rights, and we don't advance the economy of the state without really fully engaging the employer community and the entrepreneur community. That's where my staff has often heard me say that the work we do, I think, is really, really important. But in almost everything, we're the backstop, right? We're not the front line, because the front line happens in the workplaces themselves. The frontline work is working with employers. So we have to engage in that space. And so I'll give you a few examples, but in general, I would say, if you have ideas, if you have thoughts, if you want, well, I can't offer to meet you over coffee right now, but I certainly can, would look forward to the ability to connect. So
we certainly hope we can do that soon. Just a note, we have about 5 minutes left too, about 5 minutes.
Yep, I got it. So, and these slides are really to sort of sip through, but I want, just sort of slide through. We have set up one, and this is live at this link that you can see right here, downloadable resources for entrepreneurs. And this was actually being built before the pandemic, but the challenge that I put to the team was, if I'm someone who's coming to do business in Wisconsin for the first time, what do I need to know about DWD and the resources, and put it all in one place. So there's a downloadable resource packet, but there's also a series of hyperlinks. You can access this through Department of Revenue, but you can also come and get this. And again, nothing that's new here except a different way to organize it and put these things in one place. We just rolled out a soft rollout of what we're calling the EWork Board. And you can see it's dwdwisconsin.gov /eWork Board. This was this was in response to recognizing that the idea of going into your break room or your cafeteria in your workplace to look up your posters and find out, well, what are my rights as an employee and who do I call, doesn't make a lot of sense when people aren't going into workplaces. And that was true even before the pandemic. So what we've done is we've made that virtual and mobile friendly, so that anyone can go to this site, look at these, get the kind of high level, what are my rights, and instantly connect with folks to ask follow-up questions or to do a deeper dive. It's very easy to navigate and accessible via QR codes. So what we're going to be doing is making sure those codes are available on other publications, so that people who need to know what those rights are don't have to go through several levels of Google, but you can just kind of quickly get that information. We've rolled out 60-second answers to some common questions. They're 60-second videos that are really easy to share. And those are just on our ERD webpage. If you look at it, and you'll see these blocks here, like, does my employer have to let me work from home if I'm worried about COVID-19? So we try to make quick, really they're based on the questions we're getting most often, and to put them up there so they're really easy to kind of get those quick answers. We're still working on our e-newsletter. That one is primarily focused on employers and the employer community as an audience, but figuring out how to do this, we ran into some barriers, one of which was the guidance document rules, which were recently struck down by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. But the plan is to redesign that as a quarterly publication. You can go to our website now, get on our mailing list. It's free, and we'll send this out to you, and it's a great way of staying abreast of some of these laws and issues. We're working on an online hearing process. This, similar to what courts around the country are doing, we need to figure out how can we do these procedures without requiring everyone to get into a closed room for a long time. We're in a training process right now. We're on track to begin rollout as early as September, and it's going to be a very gradual process as we make sure that we are doing this with technological kinks kicked out, but also, most importantly, to make sure we're protecting everyone's due process. And we're doing this not as a replacement for in-person hearings long-term, but recognizing that it could very well be a while before we do any in-person hearings. That's not acceptable. We need to make sure that people are getting their rights. And so we are looking at in-person hearings and how to do them safely, but also online hearings, and also developing a process for doing non-contact intake and video intake. This will replace folks coming into our building to speak to our folks directly in person. But the long-term vision is, if we get this working right, we can set up kiosks that are all over the state, including job centers or libraries or places like that. So again, we're increasing the access to services. And then finally, initiatives like the SAFE initiative. We haven't been pushing this a lot, only because under the current conditions, it's hard to expect employers to put in a lot of new things. But we do know that domestic violence has increased under the last 3 months, and with more people at home. What the SAFE initiative does is it's an initiative encouraging employers to put policies in place that help protect their employees that are facing domestic or sexual violence issues, provides them some assurances of confidentiality and non-discrimination, but also explains for your particular business what's in place that might help protect them, like give them some leave, for instance, to do what they need to do to take care of themselves and their families. Take a look at the website, take a look at safe.wi.gov for more information about what you can do, including some sample policies. It's something I'm really proud of. So that's a whole lot of information in a short time, which I hope will only encourage you to reach out for that virtual coffee or conversation. And all my contact information is right here, or at least my email is. Jason, I'll put it to you in terms of how you want to.
We're running on close on time, but we do have a couple of quick questions I want to get up. But most importantly, are we able to share the slide deck? Lots of people have asked about that.
Yes.
Perfect. So I will send the slide deck out to you all because there is some really, really great information here. Got time for two quick questions, quick answers. First, thoughts on moving someone from full-time exempt to part-time non-exempt to avoid furlough. How may this affect their exempt status upon return to regular business operations and impact on FLSA?
Sure. There is no short answer on that question. I'm afraid.
Sorry.
But I would say this: work with your legal counsel, work with your HR experts. And I think it's a good idea to be creative right now because we do need to figure out solutions. And there are some solutions, there are some paths, but for me to go down those paths would take too much time right now. I'm sorry.
Sure. And then the last question from your friend Jill Hall. So when an employer calls for the agency for assistance on a matter, walks through the matter in detail and gets ERD advice, but goes in a bit of a different direction and then gets sued, is the consultation used against the employer in the investigation processing of the complaint?
So there's a certain part of that question that's that I would say is case by case, right? And I'm very hesitant to just give a blanket type situation. What I will say is this: we do want employers and we want their representatives to call and ask questions before going down a path and get some advice and get what we can. We're not going to give you legal advice like a lawyer could give you. We are going to tell you what the law says and what the administrative rules are and what to be careful with. That's pretty valuable, and we can give you that direction. Now, ultimately, what you do with that information is going to be up to you. I think that the fact that you are consulting on this doesn't create any kind of presumption that you knew you were doing something you weren't supposed to do necessarily. It's a question of what you do with that information and how it plays out. Beyond that, it's really hard to say. Like I'm sure I'm an imaginative guy, and I could imagine situations where that might come up down the road. But I would say this, that whatever risk there might be in a particular situation, you're going to want to weigh that against the risk of not checking, of not trying to find out what the boundaries are. And I have a hard time imagining cases where the risk of not checking outweighs the risk of whatever you're trying to do.
I think that sounds like good last advice, Jesus. We cannot thank you enough. Again, we had Jesus Villa, the administrator of the Equal Rights Division for the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation and for allowing us to be able to record it and to send out all of the information to our members. Really just chock full of information. Thank you. In this changing time where really, you're right, everything and nothing has changed. So thank you to Jesus so much. Last reminder, next event, large event for DMI is a week from today at 8 o'clock. We have County Executive Joe Parisi at our next virtual What's Up Downtown breakfast. Hope you can join us for that. If not, have a great weekend. Hope you all are doing well and stay healthy. Thank you all very much from all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jesus.